Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of The Last Sell, where we talk about sales journeys, sales stories, and we learn through the experiences of others. And I'm Kevin Hill. I'm your co host for this podcast, along here with Richie Daigle. How are you doing today, Richie?
Yeah, doing well. Yeah, thanks for that good intro. I feel like I forgot saying our names in the last intro. I forgot, yeah, it was very well done. I feel like I need to
Well,
take some bits from you there, Kevin.
we start talking, and then we get unfocused, and then microphones don't work, and a plethora of things just go wrong. And we just record an intro and we forget the fundamentals.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue into this episode, even though we didn't plan it, right? Our
It
guest.
works.
This is a little bit of a detour from the normal, sales stories. But I think it's an important episode for people to listen to, anyways. Our guest on this episode is Amber Deibert. If you're familiar with Amber, she's a sales coach and she works with people who are going through the experience of imposter syndrome. That is her her niche, if you will. That's her area of expertise, helping people understand it. What is it? What does it mean? Not be scared of it. All of these sorts of things. She has a lot of cool coaching. She's got a lot of great programs where you can learn more about it. But this was a cool conversation just to kind of dive into that topic, going through kind of the lens of storytelling and how that dynamic can play out in the sales arena. So yeah, I thought that was a really fun conversation. Really interesting. Always fun talking with her. And yeah, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot because I always think about imposter syndrome. And I think one of the key takeaways is, certainly don't be scared of it, but embrace it because that's how you grow. If you don't have imposter syndrome, then you're not growing. If you're in the growing phase, if you're learning new things, if you're out there, um, just in growth mode, you are going to feel imposter syndrome. It's normal, and you should be comfortable with it. Not even scared of it. Embrace it.
I agree, and I think awareness is what was my big. And this is kind of a word that I keep coming back to in a lot of different realms right now. But being aware of when you're having the experience of imposter syndrome. Also, be aware when you may be having the experience of Dunning Kruger syndrome, which is the opposite. Sometimes I feel like a bit like a pendulum swinging between the two. But I think it's good to know where you're at. And to always be curious in both scenarios, and be gentle, kind to yourself, not too hard. I mean, as salespeople, we expect perfection and all these things, but just being aware of what's happening and what you're experiencing can be quite liberating in itself.
It can. Things don't always work out. Everyone makes mistakes, but embracing those failures, embracing that, learning from it, and just really being comfortable in your own skin, and that makes imposter syndrome. What would you say? Bearable? It's
Yeah,
certainly not unbearable, um, but it kind of makes it fun too.
it's kind of I think she uses this in this episode as well, but it's like embracing the sore muscles when
Yes.
you're the day after you were lifting in the gym and trying out a whole bunch of new exercises. You're going to be sore. I can't walk. I don't like this. I can't, like, everything hurts. I don't like get me out of here. Like, give me all the protein shakes. How quickly can I get through this period? But that is the sign that you are growing and getting stronger and working out new muscle groups, etc. So super cool conversation. I hope you all enjoy it. Be sure to like, subscribe, check out Amber and her work. Go check out GoPayHawk as well, our sponsors. Go give them some love for all your payment needs, and yeah, get into it. Enjoy. So I have to ask Amber, did you watch the Super Bowl? Did you have?
I did. Guys, I lived in San Francisco for 10 years, and so I was cheering for the Niners, and I got to be honest, I was watching at the beginning and then I got so anxious. I cannot like help but feel the emotions of the other people. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. So then I just like read a book until the commercials came on and then watched all the commercials. Of course, the halftime show as well. And then it was a sad defeat.
It
Yeah, we
was.
just did an episode with Todd Lees, and he's both a Bills fan. His family's from Buffalo,
Mm-hmm.
but he grew up in the Bay Area or Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a Bills and 49ers fan, and
Yeah.
he was not feeling very good about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
bummer. It's so funny. I have a daughter, she's 4, and usually when my husband's watching football, she just cheers for whichever team has the color of outfit that she likes better. But this time they were the same color, but she did like the gold pants best. So that was the Niners.
Nice.
Funny.
We have to break this up a little bit, Kevin. I feel like we have this theme of 49ers fans coming on.
Yeah.
I know.
Super Bowl.
I know.
Taking over the world.
I
How can you
Amber,
not be?
I hear you spend a lot of time in Chattanooga. What's your favorite spot?
Oh, I
Around
used to.
town.
I used to work for a company. So I was living in San Francisco, and they had an office in Walnut Creek, which is in the Bay Area. But then their headquarters was in Chattanooga. And I honestly, I was like, I maybe have heard a song about Chattanooga, but I have no idea where that is. And so I would come to Chattanooga about once a month from San Francisco. And I have to say, the direct flights were not so good. So my jam was to fly into Nashville and then drive over to Chattanooga, because I kept getting stuck in the Chattanooga airport. Like, I don't know, there were so many like delays or whatever. I was like, I'd rather just have one flight and not have connections. But yeah, I was shocked, to be honest with you. I mean, I didn't know what to expect, but when I got there, I was like, what is going on here? Like all the rock climbing, all the paddle boarding, the downtown is so cool. We went for a run as a team and like ran up like one of the hills and had like this big view of everything. Like it is a rad little spot. And the food was amazing. Like all the little restaurants we went to downtown, I was really shocked. I have to say, I was really skeptical, and then I was blown away once I got to Chattanooga. I was like, this is great. I love it here.
Yeah, I think our next sponsor, Kevin, should be the city of Chattanooga now, just to see if they
should.
can
Yeah.
jump on board. But, so thinking of spaces and cool places, where is your absolute favorite vacation spot? You have one more vacation left ever.
Yeah.
Where is Amber going?
So whenever people, like if I'm doing a meditation or something, they're like, go to your favorite place on the planet. It's always this little beach. I think it's called Secret Beach. It's on Kauai. You have to like hike down. It's hard to get to. And there's like a bunch of sea turtles swimming over there. There's like hardly anybody because you have to hike down into it. There's trees in the back of it, but it's like right up against all these cliffs. The sand is super soft. And that is the spot. I always like imagine myself in a hammock at that spot, listening to the waves. It's the best place ever. I love Hawaii.
And follow up question: favorite beverage, alcoholic or non-alcoholic? One beverage to have with you at this beach. What do you have?
Can it be slightly frozen? Can I choose a shave ice, Hawaiian shave ice?
Hawaiian shaved ice.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I have to tell you this, but fast forward in the future, and you are on this beach, and there's Hawaiian shaved ice everywhere. There's a little table next to it. There's some there. There's actually some that are like coming up in the waves, like out of the ocean.
Whoa.
There's shaved ice. There's people walking around with it randomly. But you notice that you're on this beach and you're older now. You're done working. And it occurs to you that you are completely retired and you'll never work again. What was the last thing you sold? Or bonus, what was the last project you worked on? One of the two. What was the last thing you did?
If I'm fully retired, the last thing I sold was my business. And I think I'm fully retired in like 45 is the goal. Not super old. But it's interesting because I always think about that and I'm like, okay, let's say that I was retired. What would I want to work on? And I'm like, I'd want to do the exact same thing I'm doing every day right now. Like I kind of have the dream set up and it's so enjoyable and so interesting. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you asked like, what's the last project that I worked on? There's something that's so rewarding to me about being able to share my ideas and my thoughts on LinkedIn and with my newsletter. It's such an amazing. I recently got this book. It's the Rick Rubin book. It's called The Creative Act, and he said something in here about how I don't think it's just creatives, but he says like the creative act is not it's not like an abnormal thing. It's he equates it to like it's like a hummingbird flying. It's like something that you have to do. And I don't know if this applies to everybody, but when I heard that, I was like, yes, that's it. Like there's always going to be a part of me that needs to create and needs to share my ideas and like share my thoughts, and whether people want to listen or not, like it's so rewarding to be able to share those things and have people respond and be like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was not the only one who felt this way," or like it's so amazing to hear somebody else who has a similar story, or I never thought of considered it in that direction. So I think the project I'm always going to be working on is some kind of creative, like whether it's sharing my thoughts to myself and figuring out what's going on in that crazy brain, or it's sharing my thoughts with other people and helping them see a new side that maybe they hadn't seen before.
Kind of always reminds me the quote from Willie Nelson of whenever people told him he should retire. And he
Mm.
says, all I do is play music with my friends and golf. Which one should
Mm-hmm.
I give up?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just that creative part of you is just natural. And
Right.
you can't retire from it. You can't retire from the creativity and and the joy or whatever feeling that you get out of helping people, serving other people, creating things. That's one of those things that is untethered from money, really. You know,
Yes.
probably your most satisfying sell or coaching engagement or project didn't have dollars attached to it whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
It was for the fulfillment of that, and the dollars came in later. But and it maybe
Yeah.
opened the door for success.
Mm-hmm. I read something recently about satisfaction that kind of blew my mind. It's in the book Build a Better Life by Oprah and Arthur Brooks. And he talks about how there's like it's a book about happiness. And he talks about how there's like micro nutrients that are needed to create happiness. One is enjoyment, one is satisfaction, and I forgot the third one. It'll maybe come to me. But what he said about satisfaction was satisfaction only happens when you work hard at something and then see the result come to fruition. And creativity, like it's not an enjoyable process necessarily. Like you do something arduous. Like I think of like prospecting the same way. Like prospecting is not fun. But then when you see that you hit your number of like how many new deals you wanted, like that's fun. That's so satisfying. And I think of creativity kind of in a similar way, or like exactly what you were talking about. Like any one of these things of like signing a new deal or like getting a new client or whatever it is, like it's the satisfaction of like I worked for this. It wasn't easy what I did, and now I get to like enjoy the reward of my efforts.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like that theme comes up with a lot of creatives, whether it's authors, musicians, that they are doing the thing because they feel compelled to do the thing, and they're going to do it no matter what. If it doesn't matter if someone's listening or reading, they just have to get it out of them. They have to go through the process of creating, and that process is every bit as important as the final product.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's something there with desire. You think about all these people that are so driven to achieve whatever it is that they're going after. And the most obvious example of this is think about the scientists that were developing like nuclear energy, and they probably figured out at some point that, oh yeah, this is going to kill me. Like I'm going to die because I'm going through. I figured out I'm a scientist. I figured out like how radioactivity works.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm putting myself into that because I kind of see this greater cause or this greater
Mm-hmm.
possibility.
Yeah.
And that desire can be destructive at times, but it can also be harnessed, and it can produce a lot of cool things.
Yeah. The last thing was purpose, by the way. Enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. Having some kind of meaning behind why you're doing what you're doing.
Purpose, yes. And we see a lot of people, whether it's sales, business, art, literature, um, nuclear energy, that they have that they want the purpose, that they want the creativity, but something holds them back. And it's something that I know you talk about a lot, and that
Mm-hmm.
is imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And I post out a lot of research on LinkedIn, share a lot of content. I've been doing it for years now. And every time before I hit that post button, I get this twinge of imposter
Yeah.
syndrome
Yeah.
myself. It just
Yeah.
never goes away.
Mhm. Yeah, so let me tell you kind of my definition of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome has three different flavors, and you may have like one of these flavors, you may have all three. Most people have all three. But imposter syndrome is number one, you feel like a fraud. You feel like you're making this up, you don't know what you're doing, and people are going to find out, which is the scariest part. The second flavor of it is you feel like you just got lucky. You were in the right place at the right time. Like you just got lucky. The people who put you in this position were temporarily incompetent and didn't know what they were doing to give you this option, which, by the way, usually is combined with like, I'm surrounded by people who are super smart and I don't belong here. I'm like, how can they be super smart and also incompetent enough to put you here? Like, let's just ask ourselves that. And then the last flavor of it is downplaying your achievements, saying, I anybody could have done this. It wasn't that big of a deal. My favorite example of this is a PhD in rocket science. It was like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Anybody could have done what I did. Like, no, actually, they couldn't have. But you see these three things going on with all of us. And what imposter syndrome is not, which I think sometimes it gets lumped in here, is there are people who have, and I would include myself in this group sometimes, there are people who have this like grinding, lingering feeling of not being good enough or not being qualified enough or not ever, I don't know, it's kind of like this piece, this aspect that infiltrates multiple areas of your life, not just your professional life, but maybe your parenting, maybe your friendships, maybe your like romantic partnerships. And that usually is not kind of, I think of imposter syndrome more as like a, what is it called? Like a temporary thing, not like a lifelong thing. So if you do start to feel those, like just that really like that weight that you're carrying around of like, I'm never going to be good enough. This is never going to be good enough. Then like I definitely recommend therapy. And that's what's helped me quite a bit. But imposter syndrome is more of like a temporary, it's not like a disease. It's like a broken leg, if that makes sense. I'm trying to think of what the word is, but like something that
Yeah.
happens and can be resolved pretty quickly.
Like a temporary bout of anxiety
Yeah. Right.
that will go away.
Right.
Yes.
So, and it's really interesting too, of why you have imposter syndrome. Um, it's interesting because when you are experiencing imposter syndrome, we all think like, I'm the only one who feels this way. There's no way that my colleagues also feel this way. Like, why is it just me? And in fact, imposter syndrome, they estimate affects probably 70% of the population, but I would guess it's like 100% of the population. And imposter syndrome actually increases the higher up in rank you go in an organization. So the CEO is most likely to feel imposter syndrome, whereas like the new college grad is least likely to feel it. And there's also usually something that happens in here of feeling like the odd one out. You're more likely to feel imposter syndrome if you feel like you're different from all your colleagues. Maybe you have a different background. So many sellers come to me and they're like, well, I didn't come from a traditional sales background. And I still, like, you can fight me on this, but I'm like, there's no such thing as a traditional sales background. Like, that's not, there's no sales degree. Like, what is the sales background? Like, please tell me, like, what is the traditional sales background? However, you got into sales was the right way to get into sales.
It's the mythology that people who haven't had years of position in sales or as a salesperson makes up. That this is the quintessential sales background. That
Yes.
doesn't exist. It's just myth.
Right. So like, well, I don't qualify. I'm a fraud because I don't have the right experience. Or maybe I look different than everybody in my organization, or I'm oriented different, or I have a different race or a different gender or different orientation. Like something about me, my experience is different. So to tell a personal story, I experienced massive, massive imposter syndrome, which is why I care so much about this. My story is that I grew up in poverty. I grew up in a blue collar town. I was one of six kids. I was homeschooled. I didn't graduate high school. And then fast forward, I was working and living in San Francisco, downtown, at a tech startup. It achieved unicorn status, and I was managing a team and making six figures for the first time. And I was like, I can't let anybody know that I'm not supposed to be here. Right? Like, can you guys
Yeah.
feel that? Like, they're going to find out I'm not supposed to be here. They're going to find out that I'm poor, that I'm uneducated. Like, I have a college degree, but like, they're going to find out that I'm not supposed to be here. I'm surrounded by people who have Ivy League degrees and are super, super smart. And the imposter syndrome was so massive.
Yeah,
You're unlike the textbook example. Go ahead, Richie. Sorry.
Right.
yeah. I feel like it comes in waves, right? I feel like you said, people experience it at different times, and you said that close to everybody experiences it, and that um, it I feel like it comes in waves. Maybe, hopefully, you agree with this.
Yeah,
But there's
absolutely.
certain types, certain moments in a career or in a path where you're more likely to get hit by a wave of imposter syndrome, and you would probably know what some of those key moments are.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I will say, before we jump into having you kind of walk through some of that, typically we ask in this podcast, what was your first sale and your biggest sale and your most emotional sale? But I think we can pivot in this moment, because this is tangential to those sales stories, but it's also very important to kind of tell stories around imposter syndrome, and stories that, of course, don't give away anything sensitive, but stories that either you've experienced or in coaching or personally that may resonate, whether it's the biggest case of imposter syndrome you've ever come across, or maybe a specific scenario that was quite emotional. But I think that might be interesting to explore here. So just so our listeners understand, we're going to pivot just a little bit the storytelling from the normal range of questions here to really focus on imposter syndrome today.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, maybe you could jump into kind of some of those key moments in a career where you're most likely to see imposter syndrome come up. And then second question, what was the kind of the biggest case of imposter syndrome that you've come across, either in
Mm-hmm.
personally or in your coaching?
Mm-hmm. So, imposter syndrome, and here's like, if you hear nothing else from this episode, here's what I want you to hear. Imposter syndrome only happens when you're in a growth phase. Imposter syndrome, the opposite of imposter syndrome is complacency. I have talked to some people, not clients, but like peers and friends. Like, I remember talking to like another mom that I'd met. Our kids were in the same class, and I was talking to her about her imposter syndrome, and her husband was like, "I never have imposter syndrome. I just don't. I never have it." And I was like, "How long have you been in your job?" He's like, "7 years." And I was like, "When's the last time you got promoted?" "7 years ago." He's like, "It's just the same all the time. When you're complacent," and that, no judgment, right? Like, some people, like, this is what they go for. When you're complacent in your career, you never feel imposter syndrome because you're not growing. You're not trying to learn new skills. You already know how to do everything. Imposter syndrome only happens when you've got your next promotion, your next big project, you started at a new company, you are up leveling your skills. It only can happen if you're a success.
That makes perfect sense. That does. So only in growth can you feel like an imposter because you're trying something new. And if you're not trying something new, then you're not getting anywhere new,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and whenever you said the executives, I've been hearing, I'm part of founders community
Mm-hmm.
now in logistics, and everyone in there, from the people who are just starting out to the people who have been running startups for 5, 6, 7 years. Every day, it's a joke because we're all just making up as we go.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of feeling that imposter syndrome, because you haven't been here before. I've never
Yeah.
been a CEO of a of a $1 million company. I've never been
Mm-hmm.
one of a 1,100,000. So
Right.
each day is just you're growing, and you're kind of feeling, and it's kind of awkward, but it's addicting too. That's how I like to live life.
Absolutely. What I think about is the people who come to me and they say, like, well, I felt imposter syndrome my entire career. It's been this consistent thing. You can tell me nothing else about yourself, and I know that your career trajectory has been hockey stick growth. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. I did get promoted a lot. Like, you're just constantly putting yourself in new growth positions. But I want you to notice that the imposter syndrome is temporary. You may have had continual imposter syndrome, but it's temporary in that You might feel like an imposter the first time you do cold calling. And then you do it for a few years and you no longer feel like an imposter. And then you feel like an imposter with the first time you do demos and you feel awful. And then like pretty soon you get good at it. You don't even have to practice anymore. You like know exactly what to say. So I want you to notice that the imposter syndrome is temporary in that it's inevitable that it's going to go away as soon as you learn that skill. All you have to do is keep going through the repetitions, and pretty soon you won't feel like an imposter anymore. But where we go wrong is a lot of us feel that imposter syndrome and we make it mean that we're not cut out for it and we stop.
Yeah, it's something that I'm fascinated to the degree that you're fascinated with imposter syndrome. I'm fascinated with underdogs and the underdog
Mm.
mindset and how an underdog functions. And there's a lot of commonality because when you're an underdog, your back's against the wall and you're looking at a quote unquote impossible feat. You're going to go up against some opponent that everybody is convinced is going to crush you, or like you're heavily outmatched. But there's a freedom in that, and that you can take all of the stress that comes along with high expectations for success and say, I don't have that. I'm free from that. I can compete and engage from a position of what if. Let's see what happens. Let's give it a shot. And I think there's a lot of power in that. And you see all these great underdog stories where people overperform, like the hockey team back in the 80s that beat the Russians, and like that's a great example. But there's all these different examples of incredible underdog stories throughout the years. But it was people or teams or individuals that had this kind of level of imposter syndrome, but used it as a superpower. They like leaned into it. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any comments on underdogs and imposter syndrome or the overlap there, but curious.
Um, my whenever I hear underdogs, I always think of Malcolm Gladwell. He was on a podcast episode I listened to like decades ago, maybe, and he talked about how he never roots for the underdog. He's like, you have to be a masochist to root for the underdog because the likelihood is that they're not going to win. Why would you root for the underdog? Anyway, that's what I thought of, but not really helpful, but kind of funny. And I was like, such a good point. Why don't we root for the winner? We're going to be more likely to win if we root. Anyway,
True,
yes.
but what's the fun in that?
Right. Exactly. It's so satisfying to see the underdog win.
Yeah, there's no
And I do think,
drama. There's nothing in it
yeah,
except cold hard facts.
right. Yeah. I keep thinking of this example of a client of mine who had imposter syndrome. And what's super fascinating. So, again, I have so many people who come and set up calls with me and they're like, I gotta let you in on the secret. Like sometimes I feel like an imposter and they feel so embarrassed about it and think like they're the only ones. And I just want to be like, if you only knew how many people, like I would argue that all your colleagues have felt the exact same way as you. So this particular person already was the top seller at their software company. Like they had the number one ranking. They went to President's Club. They already were the top. And so I'm sure that all the other people in the organization were like, well, obviously that person doesn't have this problem, right? But this person came to me and was like, I get in these meetings with Fortune 50 CEOs, and I personally don't have a college degree. And I'm sitting across the table from people who are McKinsey, Harvard graduates with their MBA. And who am I to be telling them how they should run their business? And so this person's felt like they would get really befuddled with their communication. They would talk too fast. They would get like all confused and they felt like they just couldn't handle it. And not that they couldn't handle it, but they were like, I maybe need communication training because I just talk too fast because I'm so nervous. And when we helped identify the imposter syndrome and helped reframe it of like, this is just a growth phase, you would not be feeling this unless you were a massive success, which we know that you are, and reframe the way you're thinking about it. And I think of it as like, I don't ever try to solve imposter syndrome. I don't ever try to vanquish imposter syndrome. I try to just notice it, and I am a high achiever and somebody who has real big aspirations and wants to be growing. And so now when I notice it, I tell myself like, "Oh, I'm in my sweet spot. This is exactly where I want to be." Where if you talk to me, what would that be? 15 years ago when I was working for the startup, 10 years ago, If you talked to me then, I would have told you like there's something broken in my DNA. I see all these other people, they seem to be way more confident than me. I guess I'm just not a confident person and I'll never be confident. And instead now I see that same imposter syndrome as just like, oh, I'm in my sweet spot. I just have to keep going and it's inevitable that it's going to go away.
So yeah, what we're saying is normal and healthy.
Yeah. And sorry, let
That
me tell you, that seller ended up closing two massive deals. He made seven figures as a seller that year and then did it another couple years once he resolved those mindset problems.
and when you said that the communication, he got befuddled and or she
Mm-hmm.
um, in boardrooms with
Mm-hmm.
Fortune 50s. It reminds me, we were at Freightwaves and I was on live TV, or Freightwaves TV a lot of times. I had no experience. I didn't know what I
Yeah.
was doing. And I'd come off the show and I'm like, man, that was such a disaster. I
Yes.
don't even know what I was talking about. And then I'd rewatch
Mm-hmm.
it, not saying it was good, but it was just like, oh, no one out there could perceive what was going on in my head
Yes.
because it didn't show, and it just kind of went smooth. It wasn't a
Yeah.
disaster. It just went as smooth as I could do it. Um, but we get in our own heads
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes, and what we perceive is much more dramatic and overboard than what everyone else perceives.
Totally.
It reminds me of the time I was playing baseball. I got called up out of rookie ball or extended short season to high A, so I was skipping 2 levels. And Johnny Gomes' brother Joey, his locker was next to mine, and Joey had been in AAA forever. And he's like, "Where are you going?" I was like, "California." And he says, "Oh, are you nervous?" I'm like, "Yeah, I am. I'm skipping 2 levels. Like I'm nervous." He's like, "Well, all the hitters in the California League, they're terrible because if they were any good, they'd be in Double A. And when you get to Double A, all the hitters there, they're awful too because if they were any good, they'd be in Triple A. And Triple A hitters can't hit because if they were good, they'd be big leaguers. And big league hitters aren't good either because if they were any good, they'd be all stars. Watch out for the all stars; those guys are good." But it was this way of saying like same thing with imposter syndrome. The game is a game. Um, I always think of like the emperor has no clothes, the old like kid story. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when I feel the imposter syndrome, it can feel like you're walking around with no clothes on. But I think what's my little mind game is nobody has clothes on. All the emperors
Mm-hmm.
have no clothes on. So it's not that it's not that you're actually dressed. It's just everybody's feeling this. We all handle it differently. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the emotions are a big part of it. So one question to you would be, what is a story where kind of the most emotional episode of imposter syndrome that you can think about, and then maybe riffing a little bit on the role that emotions play in imposter syndrome.
That's such a good question. There's not a story that's coming to mind, but thinking about emotions, we tend to believe that our emotions are caused by the outside situation. Like, well, my boss showed up upset, so of course I'm going to be upset today. And the reason we believe this is because our caretakers, we were socialized to believe this. Our caretakers were well intentioned, but they'd say things like, oh, did he make you feel bad? Did she hurt your feelings? And so we learned that our emotions happen because of things that happen outside of us. And it's a very anxiety inducing place to be because you can't control anybody outside of you. You don't know how they're going to show up. So you don't know how you're going to feel. And it's actually a fallacy. It's not that our emotions are created by, and there's exceptions to this, like in trauma and other things, but our emotions are not created by the outside circumstance. Our emotions are created by the meaning that we assign to the outside circumstance.
It is, yeah, yeah, and I follow Stoicism. I've
Yeah,
been
yeah,
into Stoicism for about a year or so. I
yeah.
guess I've always been inclined to it, but I've gotten back into it lately, and that's one of the main tenets, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not what happens to you; it's how you react. That's what you can control.
Exactly.
You can
Right.
control how you react, and
Mm-hmm.
it's very important for your mental health
Right.
to take a deep breath, relax,
Mm-hmm.
and respond in a way that you feel proud of.
Totally. And
Yeah.
it's super interesting because your emotions are the fuel for the action that you take. There's nobody that feels super overwhelmed, super indecisive, super like worried about things, and they like go out and take amazing action. Like, no, when we feel overwhelmed, we go scroll on our phones. And so, but the times when you do feel like motivated, you're pumped up, you're feeling like awesome, you go out and you take amazing action. And depending on the action that you take, that's what gets you the results that you have. And so, feelings, I think, are a really undervalued, but really critical piece to all of this of like noticing how you're feeling. And you can change how you're feeling by changing the meaning that you assign to things. Like a lot of sellers had a really, really difficult time in 2023. It was just a really tough market.
Yep.
And so you could see like, okay, the situation outside of me is that the market is tough in 2023. And I could think like, I'm doomed. I'm never going to be able to be successful. And then I might feel like apathetic or like completely like hopeless. And then I'm not going to take very good action. Or I could see like, you know what, the market's not that great. I'm going to focus in like my meaning that I'm going to assign to it is like, I'm going to focus in on the basics. I'm going to get really good at going back to basics and practicing my maneuvers. The feeling might be kind of determined, and the action that I take is going to be way better than the alternative. I'm going to actually be taking action. I'm going to put myself in the best situation to get the results that I'm looking for. And so I do think like I obviously work with a lot of male clients because that's what the majority of sales is. And I always am like, okay, we got to talk about feelings. They're like, oh no. But I'm like, this is the critical piece that so many people are shoving down. And it actually is going to be what changes your results for you. Period.
That's so good. It reminds me of what was it? Is it Viktor Frankl who was talking
Yeah.
about what I'm looking up his quote. It says, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last pure human freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." I always love that quote because that is our one freedom that nobody can ever take away, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's really powerful. And your brain is not your primitive brain, the lower part of your brain is the one that's like operating in the moment, and it's just focused on risks. It's just focused on like, what do I need to do to stay alive? Like, if I send that email, I might die. If I give that presentation and bomb it, then I'm probably going to get fired, and then I'm going to lose all my money, and then I'm going to end up homeless, and everybody dies. So your brain is like focused on all the risks. It also, somebody, a coach that I love, she likened it to a drunk cockatoo. Like it's just like repeating things that it hears. So we have all these thoughts that are coming up that aren't even true, but it's we don't spend as much time as we need to just building the awareness of those thoughts and like recognizing like, is that actually true? Like, no, I'm not doomed. I'm probably not going to end up homeless. Even if I lose my job, I probably could find another one, but we just believe them, and then we like let ourselves spin out. And so just building the awareness and paying attention to what's going on in our brain and not believing all of it is a massive step that you can take.
But those voices should be there, right? It should be
Totally.
normal, because if they're not there, you're kind of like a psychopath or a sociopath.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with you if you don't hear those voices and that self doubt, and
Yeah.
and what generates imposter syndrome as you're out. If you're totally confident and you have no doubt about yourself, you're kind of an
Yeah.
oddball,
The
right?
goal is not to remove negative emotion. There's actually no such thing as negative emotion. There's uncomfortable emotion and unwanted emotion, and there's wanted emotion. But then things that we would deem negative emotion are the things that are keeping us alive. If you didn't have that, you'd die because you wouldn't be worried about anything.
Yeah, it's really
True.
interesting. Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling with imposter syndrome? The stories that the narratives that we create, to ourselves, the narratives that we try to live out. Like, I feel like there's a connection there with storytelling inside of our own brains and the imposter syndrome. I
Yeah.
don't want to call it an issue. I want to call it maybe like a dynamic. Is that the right word for it? The imposter syndrome dynamic.
Um, so here's how I describe imposter syndrome, and I think it's really helpful. I think I compare it to muscles, our physical body. If you go do a new workout, you maybe are like really good at CrossFit and you switch and you do Zumba, you're going to feel very uncomfortable. And afterwards, let's say it's like a really intense Zumba workout, you're going to be sore. You're going to feel muscles that you've never felt before. And I think of that muscle soreness after workout being the same thing as imposter syndrome. But the difference is when you feel sore after a workout, you think to yourself, oh, it's working. I'm using this discomfort as evidence that the growth that I'm trying to achieve is working. And imposter syndrome is the same. It's just mental discomfort that's just like sore muscles. But instead, we make it mean I'm not cut out for this. And so I think of it as like, yeah, it's a temporary thing, a passing phase that means that we're growing, and it's uncomfortable, yes, but it doesn't mean anything's wrong.
Do you think that especially the clients that you coach, right, who get to a point, do they get to the point where they harness the imposter syndrome feelings for to increase their growth, right? To that they harness the power of that to move forward. That they kind of enjoy the feelings that the anxiety of imposter, and they identify it, they label it, and they kind of ignore it or push it to the side or do
Mm-hmm.
whatever needs to be done, and
Mm-hmm.
uses that for accelerating their growth, right? Making more
Yeah.
sales. They take it and they take that, what most people perceive as negative, and they turn it into a positive, and it helps them in their career.
Yeah. The analogy I like to use is it's like swimming in a prom dress. Like swimming, sales itself is not an easy thing. It takes a lot of effort, and swimming takes a lot of effort, but you're doing it in a prom dress. Like, let's get you in a swimsuit. It's going to feel so much more comfortable. And so I think of imposter syndrome as not as like you're never going to get rid of imposter syndrome. And you probably don't want to, because that would mean that you're complacent. And the people I work with are not people who, like, complacency is like a bad word to them, right? And so it just, imposter syndrome becomes no longer this weight that you're carrying around. But it's like what Liz Gilbert says. She talks about this in her book, Big Magic. She talks about how fear is always along for the ride whenever she's writing something new, whenever she's embarking on a new project. And it used to be that fear would be in the front seat driving. And now she says, fear, like, you're going to come along the ride. I prefer you weren't here, but like, you're going to be here. But you need to sit in the back seat, and you don't have any control over where we go. You don't get to control the radio. You don't get to pick the songs, but you can come along for the ride. And I think about imposter syndrome that same way of like, it's going to be there. It's fine that it's there. And you kind of use it as a signal of like, whenever I experience imposter syndrome, I think I'm in my sweet spot. This is where I want to be. It's working. Like, the effort that I'm putting in is creating the discomfort that I'm looking for, and it's going to create new skills.
So take us through that progression. Let's say somebody is listening and they're like, oh man, I might have it. I might have this imposter syndrome. They're
Yeah.
just now having that aha moment. So from the oh no, aha, uh-oh moment of this might be me to I've just finished coaching with Amber. I'm in a better place. I'm appreciative of this. What are the various steps along that journey that you see people go through as far as kind of transitioning or progressing through this mindset of oh no and freak out to I have a
Mm-hmm.
superpower and this is normal?
Mm-hmm. Um, so it takes a lot less time than you would think. It can be like a individual coaching session that we're able to make the transformation. The very first step is definitely awareness. You have to notice when you're feeling that imposter syndrome, and the next step is just reframing it, changing your paradigm about imposter syndrome. If you start out thinking it's a really big problem, but then, like, I can talk you into believing that, like, actually it's not a problem. You're the kind of person who likes growth. You're the kind of person who wants to develop new skills and like success. So imposter syndrome is a sign that you are right there in your sweet spot. For a lot of people, that kind of releases it. And then it just comes into the practice of like, oh, I just noticed it again. I'm going to go back to, like, I'm not going to let my primitive brain like run the show and be like, this is a disaster. Like, they're going to find us out. This is going to be terrible. And instead, I'm going to like notice that I'm feeling imposter syndrome. I'm going to remember my mantra of like, I'm in my sweet spot. And it can kind of like release from there. Your brain, when you think a thought, it's two neurons in your brain connecting. And the more you think that thought, the stronger that neural pathway gets. They've done scans of people scans of the brains of people who have OCD, and they can see an actual divot in their brain where that neural pathway is of whatever their recurring thought is. And so you can think about this. I think of it as like a structural thing in your brain. Whenever your brain's like, I have to get from point A to point B, how am I going to get there? Let's choose this path that we've been going down for decades. We've always thought this about ourselves. But those paths are also just like routines and habits in your brain. It doesn't want to spend too much energy on it. So it just goes back to the default. It's kind of like if you move houses within the same city. After you move, there's probably times when you're leaving the store, you're leaving school, you're leaving the whatever, and you're leaving work, and you start driving to your old house. It's not that you're doomed for the rest of your life to keep driving to that house. You just have to remind yourself, like, oh, we got a new path to do this. And so now you're just trying to build this new neural pathway. So it just becomes awareness and going back to what you want to think about it. And slowly you can, like, that old neural pathway will break apart and the new neural pathway will become really strong, and that will become your new default.
Do you find that there's a personality trait or type that has the most difficult time getting
High
over
achievers.
imposter syndrome? I was going to say perfectionists or very
Yeah.
type A, but what did you say? Sorry,
High achievers.
high achievers.
Because they're just in it all the time. And so they think it's like they think it is a personality trait. They don't see it as a short term thing. But yeah, I definitely see my clients are typically people who are high achievers. They've been successful in the past, but they're in a slump right now. They're not sure why they're in a slump. And they definitely have some perfectionist tendencies. They have some imposter syndrome. And the biggest problem that I see with my clients is they have so many shoulds of themselves. Of like, I should be doing this way. My morning routine should look like this. I should be doing this many calls. I should be optimizing my schedule in this way. And I work with my clients to release all of those shoulds of like, let's figure out what uniquely works best for you and like dump out all the stuff that the gurus tell you that you should be doing. Like, you got to find your own routine and your own rhythm so that you can feel really safe with yourself and also build a lot of trust in yourself of actually doing what you said you were going to do.
I feel like a lot of people in business and sales are just, and high achievers especially, go, 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 go. I
Mm-hmm.
I need to have a calendar that is stacked every day. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine today. I was like, I feel like when you're in sales, you kind of fluctuate between the stress of having a completely jammed calendar and how am I going to fit all these meetings into the day and handle my emails, and not having that and dealing with the anxiety of, oh no, why is my calendar empty? So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, so you're kind of back and forth between
Me,
two kind of, yeah, yeah. That's I might
yeah.
have mentioned that to you, Kevin, but I feel like, where was I going with this? I feel like, what are your thoughts on the importance of intentional boredom, which is what I'm going to call meditation, or being intentional about unplugging and getting away from
Mm-hmm.
everything. Where does that fit into the imposter syndrome spectrum? What are your thoughts there?
I don't know that that necessarily fits into imposter syndrome, but it definitely fits into being a high achieving seller. My goal for all my clients is to get them to a place where they are first and foremost prioritizing their work. You can make massive change for yourself by just doing the most important thing and knowing what the most important thing is. Like, if you have nothing else, like, start there. Just write down every day 3 to 5 things on a post-it note that you have to get done that day and get them done. And like that alone will create massive change for people. But so I work with my clients on, like, first, like, knowing what the most important work is, doing that most important work during what I call your superhero hours when you're most alert. Like, let's just get it done. And then my goal for all of my clients is that they have massive pockets of open space in their day. And the reason that I think it's so important, and I don't call it boredom necessarily, and I also am like neurodiverse. I don't do well with meditation. And um, so I encourage my clients, if they're like me, if you can meditate, great. But if they're like me, I encourage them to just go for walks. It's really helpful for me to create space for myself to be able to think about things, but I can't do it meditating or whatever else. Like, I need to, like, trick my body into being like, we're doing something productive by going for a walk. But like, it's really just an escape for me to be able to think. when you have that spaciousness, you're able to create so many more solutions to your problems. The clients that I work with are enterprise and strategic account executives, and you cannot be strategic unless you have time to think about the strategy. So the highest bang for your buck and the highest value activity that you can do is allowing yourself the spaciousness to think. So I think it's a really key thing that a lot of people aren't talking about.
It is essential. It is essential. You need your quiet time. You need a packed calendar, but you need your quiet time.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are days that you need to forego everything and recharge and create a strategy that will help you get to that higher level. Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Amber, it's been great having you on the show. Uh, Again, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah.
And Amber, before we let you go, where can our listeners find you if they want to get in touch or about coaching or if they have questions about imposter syndrome? How can people
Yeah.
find
For this podcast audience, I open up a few slots. So if you want to have any more conversation about this, like feel free to reach out to me. You can find my schedule at mentalmastery.com and just click on work with me. You'll see my schedule there. And if you want to follow along, get any more of my information, you can also join my newsletter there, or I post on LinkedIn every day. You can see all my thoughts, all my unsolicited advice over on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Amber.